Nathaniel Nate Carter had spent his whole life fighting against gravity, the pull of his past, the weight of expectations, the sheer force of a world that seemed determined to drag him down. But he had never let it win. Not when his mother died of pneumonia because they couldn't afford a hospital visit. Not when his father, once a skilled mechanic with calloused hands and a sharp mind, had drowned himself in whiskey and poker tables. And certainly not when people whispered that kids like him, poor, broken, forgotten, weren't meant to make it. He had proven them wrong. At 24, Nate was a rising star in the medical field, a top student at Johns Hopkins University, and the recipient of a full-ride scholarship. The dream he had built, brick by brick, was finally becoming real. Long nights buried in textbooks, endless hours spent in labs, the sacrifices of youth traded for something greater. It was all worth it. He was on the verge of something extraordinary, on the cusp of becoming the doctor he had always dreamed of being. Until the phone call. It came late one evening as Nate sat in his tiny off-campus apartment, skimming through research papers. His phone buzzed, an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but, on instinct, picked up. "Mr. Carter?" The voice on the other end was firm, professional. "This is Linda Reyes from First National Bank. I'm calling regarding your account." Nate frowned, setting down his pen. "My account? There's been a withdrawal. A substantial one. Nearly all funds have been transferred." A cold feeling slid down his spine. "That's not possible. I understand your concern, but the transaction was authorized by Henry Carter." The world tilted. "No. There has to be a mistake." "I'm afraid not. Mr. Carter withdrew the full balance this afternoon. I wanted to confirm since this leaves your account nearly empty." Nate's hands went numb, his pulse thudding in his ears. He barely remembered the rest of the call. The bank's polite apologies, the confirmation that the money was gone, the suggestion to file a report. None of it mattered. His tuition, his rent, the research grant he had been awarded, everything he had worked for, vanished. His father had taken it all. The walk to their old apartment felt like a fever dream. His fists clenched so tightly his nails bit into his skin, rage warring with disbelief. By the time he reached the crumbling complex where his father still lived, his breath was ragged, his vision sharp with anger. He found Henry Carter exactly where he expected, in the dimly lit living room, slumped over a stained poker table, the air thick with cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey. Stacks of poker chips sat beside an empty glass. A few men, strangers, all of them, eyed Nate as he entered, their expressions a mixture of boredom and curiosity. Henry looked up, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus. "Nate," he slurred, attempting a lazy smile. "Didn't expect to see you here." Nate's voice was like steel. "Where's my money?" His father blinked. "What?" "The scholarship. The research grant. My tuition. The money I saved. Where is it?" For a moment, there was silence. Then Henry sighed and leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, kid, I was in a rough spot. Had a chance to win big. Thought I could." Nate slammed his hands onto the table, rattling the poker chips. "You stole my future." The other men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. But Henry, his father, just exhaled, shaking his head. "It's just money, Nate. You'll figure something out. You always do." Something inside Nate cracked. Just money. Just money, when it had taken him years to climb out of the hole life had buried him in. Just money, when it was the only thing standing between him and the future he had bled for. Just money, when it was all he had left. He stepped back, his hands shaking, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to make his father feel just an ounce of the betrayal crushing him. Instead, he turned and walked away. Outside, the city stretched around him, indifferent and uncaring. The future that had once been so clear, medical school, research, a life dedicated to saving others, was now nothing more than a mirage, evaporating in front of him. For the first time in his life, Nate Carter had no idea what to do next. The days that followed felt like freefall. Nate Carter had spent years defying the odds, climbing toward a future that had once seemed impossible. Now, in the span of a single night, he had lost everything. No tuition, no research grant, no way to pay rent. His scholarship was non-refundable. Once the funds were withdrawn, they were gone. Permanently. He spent hours on the phone with the university, trying to explain, trying to plead his case. But rules were rules. The money had been issued to his account, and what happened after that was his responsibility. No exceptions. The landlord wasn't any more sympathetic. "I give you until the end of the month," she said, her voice firm, practiced. No money, no apartment. By the time he walked out of the leasing office, his hands were trembling. It wasn't just the fear, though that was there, gnawing at the edges of his mind. It was the helplessness. The crushing, suffocating realization that for the first time since he was a kid, he had nowhere to go. And his father, the man who had put him in this position, hadn't even bothered to call. Desperation drove him to the university's financial aid office, but their hands were tied. He applied for emergency assistance, scholarships, loans, anything to keep himself afloat, but funding took time. Time he didn't have. By the end of the week, his fridge was empty and his bank account was a black hole. Nate had always thought of himself as resilient, someone who could take a hit and keep going. But this was different. This wasn't just a setback. This was ruin. When he finally ran out of options, he packed what little he had left into a worn-out duffel bag and left his apartment for the last time. The first night, he slept in the university library, pretending to study until the janitor kicked him out. The second night, he found an empty lecture hall and curled up behind the podium, using his coat as a blanket. By the third night, exhaustion turned to something colder, heavier. He needed money. Fast. Hospitals wouldn't take him without an active enrollment. Research labs weren't hiring. The only places that would even consider him were the ones that paid cash, no questions asked. So Nate swallowed his pride and took a job washing dishes at a greasy diner on the outskirts of Baltimore. 12-hour shifts, minimum wage, hands raw from scalding water and cheap detergent. He worked until his fingers ached, until the exhaustion drowned out the hunger, until he was too tired to think about everything he had lost. But the worst part wasn't the work. It was seeing his classmates, future doctors, surgeons, researchers, walk past the diner in their crisp white coats, laughing, planning, moving forward. And him? He was stuck in place. One night, after a particularly brutal shift, Nate sat outside the diner, staring at his reflection in the cracked window. He barely recognized himself, hollow eyes, slumped shoulders, the smell of grease and desperation clinging to his clothes. Is this it? He thought. Is this where I stay? For the first time, doubt crept in. Maybe this was what life had planned for him all along. Maybe no matter how hard he fought, he'd always end up back where he started. But then he thought about his mother, about the way she had fought, even when the world gave her nothing, about the night she had stayed up, pressing cool rags to his forehead when he was sick, whispering that he was meant for more. More. Nate clenched his fists. He couldn't let it end like this. The next morning, he woke up with a plan. He started applying for every medical-related job he could find. Lab tech, research assistant, EMT. Anything that would get him back on track. He used the university's public computers, sending out applications between shifts, studying whenever he had a free moment. Days turned to weeks. The rejection emails piled up. But he kept going. Then, one afternoon, as he was scraping leftover eggs off a plate, his phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. "This is Dr. Patel from Mercy Medical," the voice on the other end said. "I saw your application for the night shift ER tech position. Can you come in for an interview?" Nate almost dropped the plate. "Yes," he said, heart pounding. "Yes, I can." The interview was brutal. Dr. Patel grilled him on procedures, emergency protocols, patient care. But Nate was ready. He answered every question with precision, fueled by months of studying and years of experience shadowing surgeons. At the end, Dr. Patel leaned back, studying him. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" Nate swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. And yet, you're still here." A pause. "Then, you start Monday." Relief flooded through him so fast he almost couldn't breathe. He had done it. It wasn't medical school, it wasn't the research grant, but it was a foothold. A way back. He had fallen, but he wasn't broken. And for the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that he could still rise. The emergency room was chaos incarnate, an endless tide of blood, panic, and desperation. But for Nate Carter, it was salvation. From the moment he stepped onto the ER floor at Mercy Medical, he knew he belonged there. It wasn't medical school. It wasn't the research lab he had dreamed of. But it was medicine. It was real. And it was his. His first few weeks were brutal. The night shift stretched into morning, an exhausting blur of ringing alarms, shattered bones, and frantic parents clutching their children. The doctors barked orders. The nurses worked with machine-like precision. And Nate? He ran. He lifted patients, cleaned wounds, held hands, and whispered reassurances to people on the worst nights of their lives. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it mattered. And for the first time since his father had stolen his future out from under him, Nate felt like he was fighting back. At the end of each shift, he collapsed onto the cot in his tiny rented room and forced himself to study. He read every textbook he could get his hands on, memorizing procedures and diagnoses with the same intensity that had once driven him to the top of his medical class. Every dollar he earned went toward two things: rent and saving for the MCAT. He ate instant ramen, drank bad coffee, and ignored the exhaustion clawing at his bones. Failure wasn't an option. But no matter how hard he worked, he knew it wasn't enough. Medical schools wouldn't just look at his past accomplishments. They'd see the gap, the missing year, the sudden crash from brilliance to nothing. And they'd ask questions. He needed more than just a comeback. He needed something extraordinary. The opportunity came in the form of a late-night trauma case. A young boy, maybe 10, brought in with a deep laceration to his arm. He had been playing near a construction site when he fell onto a piece of jagged metal. The bleeding was severe. Nate had seen worse. He moved on instinct, applying pressure, stabilizing the boy while the overworked doctors stitched the wound. But it wasn't the injury that caught Nate's attention. It was the boy's mother. She had the unmistakable exhaustion of someone who had seen too much suffering. She wore a faded NGO vest, her skin darkened from the relentless sun of some distant country. When the boy was stable, she turned to Nate. "You handled that well," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Just doing my job." Her sharp eyes studied him. "You're more than a tech. What's your story?" For a moment, he hesitated. Then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he told her. About medical school. About his father. About losing everything. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she pulled a card from her pocket and handed it to him. "Dr. Evelyn Moore, WHO Global Health Initiative. I run a medical research team in West Africa," she said. "We need people who don't break under pressure. People who can handle real medicine in real conditions." She met his gaze. "If you're serious about getting back on track, consider applying." Then she was gone. Nate stared at the card for a long time. The decision should have been easy. It was a chance to rebuild his career, to prove himself in ways no medical school could ignore. But it was also a risk. Leaving meant uprooting his fragile stability, stepping into the unknown with nothing but a promise from a woman he barely knew. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't fought this hard just to survive. He wanted more. So, he did the only thing that made sense. He applied. 3 weeks later, he stood in the airport with a single duffel bag and a one-way ticket to Senegal. As the plane lifted off, he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The evening heat clung to Nate Carter's skin as he sat outside the clinic, staring at the email on his cracked laptop screen. The glow from the screen barely illuminated his face, but his heart pounded as if it were shouting the words into the night. "Congratulations. You have been accepted into Johns Hopkins Medical School." This was it. The dream he had fought for. The chance to walk into one of the world's most prestigious medical programs, to prove to himself, and to the world, that he had made it. So why did his chest feel tight? Why wasn't he celebrating? The voices of the clinic hummed behind him. Patients murmuring in Wolof, the shuffle of feet, the occasional cry of a sick child. It had been 2 years since he arrived in Senegal with the WHO research team, thinking it would be temporary, a stepping stone to reclaiming his medical career. But now, the idea of leaving felt wrong. A figure leaned against the doorway. Dr. Evelyn Moore, his mentor, a woman who had seen him at his lowest and had pushed him beyond his limits. She studied him with knowing eyes. "Something tells me that's not good news," she said. Nate exhaled, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "It's medical school." He hesitated. "Johns Hopkins." She let out a slow breath, her arms crossing. "Well, damn." He chuckled dryly. "Yeah." A long silence stretched between them before she finally spoke. "So, are you going?" The question lingered in the air, heavier than the humidity around them. Nate had spent the past 2 years working on the front lines of global health crises. He had treated children on the brink of death, delivered babies in makeshift tents, watched villagers fight through malaria, malnutrition, and now cholera. And he had learned, not from textbooks, but from experience, the kind of knowledge that no medical school could ever teach. Here, he wasn't just another aspiring doctor buried under student loans and lecture halls. He was part of something real, something that mattered. But Johns Hopkins was the dream, the goal he had once thought stolen from him. The past clawed at him. The memory of his father gambling away his future, of being forced to start over from nothing. He had fought to rise from the ashes, to claw his way back to this very moment. Could he really turn it down now? And yet, the faces of the people he had helped filled his mind. The boy with malaria who had clung to his hand. The mother who had sobbed with gratitude when her daughter survived cholera. The team who had become his family. If he left, what would happen to them? As if the universe wanted to push him toward a decision, the crisis hit that night. An outbreak of cholera swept through a nearby village. Within hours, the clinic was overwhelmed. Patients poured in, their bodies weak and trembling from dehydration. Nate didn't think, he just moved. Administering IVs, checking vitals, comforting terrified families. The hours blurred together into a relentless battle against time and disease. At one point, he found himself kneeling beside a girl no older than 7, her skin clammy, her breath shallow. He gripped her tiny hand. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, though his own hands shook with exhaustion. He didn't know when the sun rose. He only knew that when the girl finally opened her eyes, when the fever broke, he felt something shift inside him. This was where he belonged. The next morning, Nate walked into Evelyn's office, his decision solidified in his chest. He handed her the email, now with a response typed beneath it. She read it, then looked up. "You turned them down?" Nate nodded. Evelyn leaned back, studying him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, a small smile tugged at her lips. "You're insane, Carter," she said. "But you made the right choice." Relief flooded through him. Not fear, not regret, relief. He had spent so long chasing the future he thought he needed. But now, he realized, he had already found his purpose. And he wasn't going anywhere. The desert sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep orange and crimson. The air was thick with heat, but the evening breeze carried a faint sense of relief. Nate Carter stood at the entrance of the clinic, watching as the last of the day's patients shuffled toward their homes, some healthier than they had arrived, others clutching bags of medicine and instructions scrawled in careful handwriting. He should have been exhausted. He had barely slept in days, the cholera outbreak pushing the clinic to its limits. But instead of weariness, something else filled him, a quiet, unshakable certainty. It had been 6 months since he made his choice. 6 months since he turned down the opportunity that had once been his ultimate goal. And he had not looked back. Tonight, though, was different. Tonight, he was being asked to step into something even greater. Dr. Evelyn Moore approached, a thin folder tucked under her arm. She gave him a knowing look before handing it to him. "Read it," she said simply. Nate flipped it open, scanning the typed words, his breath catching in his chest. The letter was from the WHO's central office, an invitation to lead a new research initiative in West Africa, focusing on the prevention and rapid response to future cholera outbreaks. His mind reeled. This wasn't just about working in a clinic anymore. This was about something bigger, creating systems that could save thousands, maybe millions, of lives. He swallowed hard, the weight of it sinking in. "They want me to lead this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn smirked. "They want the best. And after what you pulled off during this outbreak, you're exactly that." Nate let out a slow breath. A part of him still felt like that kid who had lost everything, the student whose dreams had been gambled away by a father who never saw his worth. But that kid was gone now. In his place stood a man who had fought his way back, not through privilege, not through status, but through grit, sweat, and a relentless determination to serve. He looked back at Evelyn. "And you?" "I'll be right here," she said. "But this is your chance to make a real impact." His fingers tightened around the folder. It wasn't an easy choice. The clinic had become his home, these people his family. But deep down, he knew this was the next step. The night before he was set to leave, the village gathered. It wasn't an extravagant affair, just simple music, food, and laughter. The children clung to his arms, the elders grasped his hands, thanking him in languages he had come to understand in the way only a doctor could, through the language of healing. Evelyn raised a glass. "To Nate Carter." The man who came here broken and built himself into something unstoppable. Laughter and applause filled the air, but Nate could barely speak. He wasn't good with goodbyes. When the crowd finally thinned, he found himself sitting with the young girl he had saved during the cholera outbreak, the one whose frail hand he had held through the worst of it. "You're leaving," she said softly. Not a question, just a statement. Nate nodded. "Yeah." She was quiet for a long moment before she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, woven bracelet. "Take this," she said, "so you don't forget." He felt his throat tighten as he slipped it onto his wrist. "I won't forget," he promised. The next morning, as his plane lifted off the dusty runway, Nate watched the land shrink beneath him. The past had taken so much from him, but he had built something greater in its place. And now, he was ready to give even more. Because this was never just about him. It never had been. As the plane soared higher, Nate Carter leaned back in his seat, the weight of his journey pressing against him, not as a burden, but as a testament to everything he had fought for. He had once believed that success was measured in titles, in the prestige of a white coat worn in the halls of an elite hospital. But life had rewritten that story for him. Pain had shaped him. Loss had driven him. But purpose, that was what had defined him. He had learned that resilience was not just about surviving. It was about rising, about choosing every single day to stand back up no matter how many times the world knocked you down. He had lost everything once, but in that loss, he had found something far greater, his reason for fighting. Not for money, not for reputation, but for the lives of those who had no one else to fight for them. This was the truth he had come to understand. Greatness is not built in comfort. It is forged in struggle. It is carved out of the moments when quitting seems easier, but pushing forward means everything. As the clouds stretched endlessly before him, Nate closed his eyes, the woven bracelet still snug around his wrist. He had started this journey thinking it was about reclaiming his future, but in the end, it had never been about him. It had always been about something bigger, something worth sacrificing for, and he wouldn't have it any other way.